PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. I'd like to show you a strategic masterpiece played by Boris Spassky against Bobby Fischer, no less. Now, this game is from the 1992 match between Fischer and Spassky, which I have to say was a peculiar spectacle with both players past their best, and it was played in a country torn apart by civil war and the whole match was funded by a businessman with rather a dubious reputation. So I've always been reluctant to get into these games. Nevertheless, this game I still really, really like. So here we go. Spassky playing white. D4. Here we go. Classical chess. He puts his pawns in the middle and fights for control of the centre. So Fischer playing a kind of Benoni, but not the main line with e6. He goes for d6. And this does allow white to occupy the centre, which Spassky is always very happy to do, and gives white a little bit more freedom in how he develops as well. And this can transpose back into sort of normalish Benoni lines. I mean, knight e2 is possible here, but anyway, knight f3 played by Spassky. So all very straightforward. And Fischer decides to get a little bit more control over the dark squares in the middle by playing bishop g4. Often in the Benoni, this bishop really doesn't have much of a function. So, well, in some ways it's logical to exchange this off. However, we're going to see that the fact that white has the two bishops in this game is of great significance. Let's put it like that. Knight d7 played by Fischer. Might be best to try and open things straight away, but anyway, knight d7. Queen d1. e6 and Spassky castles. E takes d5. Now, this is a very interesting moment in the game. Obviously, white has three ways of recapturing that pawn. I think we can rule out knight takes, exchanges pieces and opens up the bishop. That feels nice for black. But which one would you play? C takes or E takes? So C takes is a more traditional Benoni setup. And black has all the usual counterplay with attempting to advance the queenside pawn majority. It's possible. But Spassky goes for E takes. And very often, if one has the option to do this, it's a good idea. Because it's harder for black to get this in, and somehow even if b5 comes, it's less significant. And, well, white can potentially use the bishops pointing in this direction to actually attack black on the king side. So let's see how things develop. Knight e8. So Fischer wants to allow the f-pawn to advance. Bishop d2. Knight e5. Hits the bishop, which has to maintain protection of this pawn. So bishop e2. And Fischer plays f5. Okay. So how do you play with white? So here's your moment to have a little think. I'll have a drink. And how would you play for white in this position? Can you devise a strategy? While you're thinking about that, quick reminder about my broadcasts, series of 3 broadcasts starting on Friday 21st of March, 8 p.m. UK time. And I'm going to be running a little course, the biggest mistakes that amateurs make. So if you want to improve your chess, then do join me and book your spot. You've got to be a patron of the channel to join in the live broadcast. So do check out patreon.com/PowerPlayChess, and you can subscribe at various levels, $5, $25. and you get various rewards according to how much you contribute. Right, how are you doing? White to play. Spassky played f4. So that pushes the knight away, looks very natural. And this is a key move. Hopefully you planned this one as well. g4. This is where white wants to attack. On the king side. Because this is going to take away squares from black's knights. So if this pawn advance doesn't come, then this knight might settle on f6 and later on have perhaps the option to come in here. But at the moment there's a threat to take here, weaken that pawn, and you can see that white has good possibilities to attack the pawn on f5 and move the king across and attack on the g file. So that's why Fischer played knight h6. By the way, if queen h4, then simply king g2, and that queen can be driven away, or, well, be careful, it could be a threat to trap it with g5 and then bishop e1. So that's why Fischer played knight h6 to support that pawn. Obviously white doesn't want to take now, because that gives the knight a beautiful square. Spassky's strategy is all about restricting those knights. He played king g2. So just for the moment, keeping options open. It's nice to sort of follow up these pawns. He could have played g5 straight away. And he does that now, g5. So pushing the knight back. It's hard to get past this pawn here. But push on. Okay, so why has Spassky closed this? Well, as I said, it's all about restricting these knights. So these squares are taken. This square is taken. So, these knights, they're not well placed. They don't have many options in this position. And they just get in the way of black's pieces, actually. Okay, what about a strategy for white? Okay, Spassky played rook b1. That's kind of preemptive. He knows that the b file might open, and it's just good to take the rook away from the long diagonal. It's not strictly necessary. Rook e8. There are some weak squares down the e file, but the thing is, with these bishops, all those squares are covered. So white is doing quite well. Rook b8. Yeah, I mean, this is really black's only source of counterplay. h4. So Spassky still has in mind some kingside action. And queen c2. Yeah, there could potentially be a sacrifice here. b5. Okay, Fischer gets that in. But b3 is solid. And rook b7. Still hard for black to sort of stir things up. Exchanging, well, b file is covered, so everything is okay there. This knight gets in the way, you can see. It even blocks that queen. Very annoying. Fischer played rook b7. Spassky just switched across to the e-file. Well, he might be able to use the e-file now that the rooks are split. An exchange and queen b8. Okay, so Fischer is perhaps thinking about getting a rook in here. But bishop c1, everything is covered. And be careful of potentially a rook invasion. So queen d8. Okay, so what's Spassky doing? I mean, this advance with the h-pawn, it's pretty clear that there's too much going on, on the queen side, or enough going on the queen side, that trying to switch to some kind of crude kingside attack and getting the queen on h7, too time consuming. But this is an interesting strategy. Knight e2. exchange on c4. And Fischer put the knight back on e8. Not a beautiful square, but that's just about improving the connection on the second rank. And this knight obviously isn't going anywhere. h5. So why did Fischer suddenly kind of retreat? Well, I think he's concerned about this move. Spassky didn't do this. He could have done this, actually, with some ideas to sacrifice on f5. And we're going to see some of that a bit later on as well. But anyway, first of all, Spassky played h5. He's got a plan. Let's watch what happened. Rook e7. h6. So now that's an unpleasant choice for black. You don't really want to go back to f8. That looks really passive. But bishop h8, well, at least it's on this diagonal still. But it's interesting, you know, Spassky isn't bothering with the open h file. But these pawns are absolutely beautiful, taking away all these squares from black's pieces. Bishop d2, rook b7. Okay, so the rook still wants to sort of be irritating and you know, potentially coming on b2. Bishop c1 is possible, but then, I don't know, queen a5. There could be a little bit of counterplay at some point. But Spassky, he's very cool. He just plays rook b1. He's not afraid to exchange off the major pieces. Queen b8, knight g3. So he's getting ready to take on f5. Which, well, we get 2 pawns for the piece and a third one coming, and those pawns look amazing. So at that point, Fischer decided, okay, I've got to exchange off all the major pieces. My king is potentially in trouble. And he's pinning his hopes on perhaps holding out in this position. But actually, this is hopeless, because white still has the potential to sacrifice here and get through to h7. These knights are still absolutely dreadful. They just can't break out. And there is a way for white to break into the position. I mean, I dare say the immediate sacrifice is not bad for white. But there's no need to do that. Okay, what did Spassky do next? Well, if you've enjoyed this kind of space advantage in your own games, I'm sure you'll appreciate what happens next. Basically, Spassky wants to get his king here and break in on the queen side, and it doesn't take too much imagination to swing it round to the queen side. I mean, black's position is utterly lost. You know, if the king goes immediately, then already you can see the h-pawn will drop, and that really is hopeless. So that's why Fischer played knight h8. I mean, that's a really grim move, so that he can potentially block on g6 after the sacrifice. But anyway, there's no need to get involved in that. The king swings over, king b3. Very simple idea. And bishop f2. So Fischer is provoking this sack. It's quite interesting. I mean, it is possible to do this. I honestly don't think that black can survive this. It looks absolutely hopeless to me. Knight g6 doesn't work because of this, and bishop c3. Looks simple. I'm sure this is winning. You know, black can sack back a piece, but you know, something like this, white's a pawn up on the king side, and the king is just breaking through. Must be winning. But it's interesting that Spassky, this is old man's chess. He didn't sack. He just played knight h1, I'm sure in his younger days he'd have just crashed through. But Spassky presumably was enjoying himself with this king maneuver and thought, well, why not? Fischer played bishop h4. So he obviously thought that was his last chance to keep this knight trapped in. But then again, that bishop doesn't look too clever either. It's also trapped. So Spassky continued his march with the king. So I really like this. So threat king b7 and bishop a5 to win the a pawn. So the king had to come back. Bishop c2. Now this one comes in. See, those two bishops are just dreamy. They're both fantastic pieces. I mean, there were moments earlier on in the game when Spassky could have legitimately played bishop c3 to exchange off that dark squared bishop, but well, he understood that he didn't need to. King b8, bishop d7. Black is almost in Zugzwang. I mean, this is a very good illustration of exactly how Spassky's strategy, right from when he played f4 and g4, g5, etc. How it all works out beautifully, because these knights, you can see, they have no possibilities. Here, Fischer played knight a8 and king takes a6. That was winning. But if Black tries to hold with knight f7, then bishop e6. I mean, that can't be taken. The pawn just rolls through. I mean, this is pitiful. Something like this, unbelievable. And if knight d8, bishop g8. There we go. The h pawn comes good, and that bishop is going to take all the pawns. So anyway, the game finished like this, knight a8 check. And Fischer succeeded in pushing the king back, but by this stage, Spassky had no objection to putting the king back to safety. I mean, if necessary later on, of course, White could advance the a pawn, but actually there's no need, because White breaks through immediately on the king side like this. Bishop f6, and there's a reason that this bishop comes here first before sacrificing. We're going to see it. And now, finally, there was a sacrifice on the king side, and the game finished like this. And not h7 because of knight f7, but first of all, bishop takes knight. That was the final position, of course, if king takes, and the pawn goes through. Wow. I love that kind of global strategy. But this was the start of it. f4 and g4, claiming space on the king side. Actually, I mean, this kind of structure with the two bishops is very well known. You also get it from the Averbach variation of the King's Indian. I found another game in this line from 1979, Anikayev against Balashov, Minsk 79. It's also very good for White. Game went like this. Slightly different because Balashov didn't advance the f-pawn, but also very promising. g4, this is absolutely typical strategy to take squares away from the knights. Game went like this. Knight had dropped back and White had a huge positional advantage. White still wants to squash with h4 and g5 actually. It's also very, very strong, although somehow Balashov ended up winning that game. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that game and my coverage of some of, well, for me, Spassky's best games or most instructive games. I admired him greatly. What a player, what a man as well. Thanks for watching.